Good evening, everybody, and good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the 57th episode of Dhammapariyesanā, wherein which we discuss not only Buddhist topics themselves, we are also discussing some of the uh, contemporary issues that have a link to uh, Buddhism as well as the issues that uh, we see in the world. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome today's guest, Assistant Professor Natalie Avalos. Uh, she is going to discuss with me, and I'm going to ask questions from her about an interesting intersection about Native Americans, especially in the United States. Uh, so, our topic is going to be healing from historical trauma.
Mhm.
Let me paraphrase Dr. Avalos' bio a little bit. Natalie Avalos is an assistant professor in the Ethnic Studies Department at the University of Colorado Boulder. She received her doctorate from the University of California at Santa Barbara in religious studies in 2015, with a special focus on Native American and indigenous religious traditions and Tibetan Buddhism. So there's a link to the Buddhist uh, aspect too. Dr. Avalos is an ethnographer of religion whose research and teaching focus on comparative Indigeneities, urban Indian and Tibetan refugee religious life, decolonial praxis, and healing historical trauma, the exact topic that we're going to be discussing today. Prior to joining University of Colorado Boulder, where she's now teaching as a postdoc, she taught in the Religious Studies Department at Connecticut College.
Mhm.
She is currently working on her manuscript titled The Metaphysics of Decoloniality, Transnational Indigeneities and Religious Refusal. So the research that I just mentioned argues that the reassertion of land-based logics among Native and Tibetan peoples not only decenters settler colonial claims to legitimate knowledge, but also articulates forms of sovereignty rooted in interdependent relations of power among all persons, human and other than human. She's also a Chicana of Apache descent, born and raised in the Bay Area. Dr. Avalos publishes on Native American and indigenous religious traditions, Tibetan Buddhism, race and religion, social justice, and decolonialization. If you want to check out some of her scholarly works, you can check out the link, uh, her faculty profile, http://www.colorado.edu/ethnic studies/people/co-faculties Natalie Avalos, which you can probably see on the blog post here. Probably we can post it here. Uh, Professor Avalos, thank you for joining with me today.
Yeah, thank
How
you
are you,
for,
how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. It's a nice day today, and I'm glad that we still have some good sunlight for this talk. Yeah.
Oh, great. All right. So let's take a look at of the topic healing from historical trauma. It appears to me there is a psychological aspect to this, area of your studies is trauma. A lot of people understand trauma from a psychological point of view, and then as you mentioned, historical perspective. So, how do we understand this historical trauma, the topic of historical trauma, um, as a regular person about the topic who might have no idea about what is historical trauma? They might know trauma a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a good question, partly because we have a tendency to think of trauma as something that maybe is ubiquitous and maybe even homogenous. And there are different kinds of trauma. And really, the work and research on trauma has just exploded in the last 10 years. But the work specifically on historical trauma began to be developed in the 80s and 90s. It was initially developed with survivors of the Holocaust, actually, and psych researchers were trying to understand why was it that descendants, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of Holocaust survivors were exhibiting high levels of anxiety, depression, suicidality, and other forms of psychological distress. And really, researchers began to understand that major impactful events, genocides, such as what Jewish peoples experienced in the middle 20th century, were actually impacting peoples in such deep core ways that their descendants became impacted. And so in the 80s and 90s, there were some American Indian researchers, folks like Lakota clinical social worker Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who began to talk about historical trauma among Native American populations. And she essentially was saying, they have also experienced a genocide. They have also experienced such deep traumatic events in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And they had very similar impacts generationally. And so that is essentially why we can think of it as historical, that it is attached to maybe historical events, and that those events live on within people's bodies, within people's psyches, and that they essentially live on cumulatively for generations, within families.
Great. That's a good start to look at how this historical trauma and then where it comes from, actually. So, because I'm actually particularly focused on an article that you wrote to one of the journals called AMA Journal of Ethics. Slogan is Illuminating the Art of Medicine, which you published in June 2021 by the exact name, Healing from Historical Trauma. So in the article, you say that historical trauma is not just a bunch of events that have happened, as you said just now, in 70s, 80s, or probably, in that past. It has elements to structural violence in the form of settler colonialism. So looks like, this could have been happening even in the recent past, probably even at this moment of the book.
Yeah.
And you particularly mentioned about this settler colonialism. And as a part of that, you also mentioned other issues as well, like you said, about the major events that made historical trauma to Native Americans, like land dispossession, racism, and probably poverty. So what is this settler colonialism? For someone who is pretty ignorant about this word and this dimension of the historical trauma, what is settler colonialism, and how has the structural legacies of settler colonialism has impacted to this historical trauma? How do we understand?
Yeah, what's the connection? Yeah, so settler colonialism, again, we sometimes think, well, all colonialisms are the same. And they're actually not. They operate differently, right? So the kind of, if we think imperial projects more broadly, they have colonial mechanisms that exist materially in different ways, right? So the kind of British imperialism that was enacted in, say, South Asia, a place like India, for instance, it was a place like India is so densely populated, and English people were not necessarily looking to settle in India and take over India's land. They wanted to control resources, control them politically, economically. And so that's what we often think of as colonialism. But settler colonialism is distinct in the sense that settlers, so when Spanish settlers and English settlers came to the Americas and they were exploring the Americas, there were people here, and it was densely populated initially, but due to disease and other forms of violence, warfare, um, the Americas lost up to, some scholars estimate, 90% of its population within the first, um, 50 to 100 years of colonizing bodies coming to the Americas. So there was this sense also that, well, maybe it's a new world that could be literally settled, and that these settlers could come from other regions of the world, namely Europe, and could essentially take over and re-inhabit and populate it. And so settler colonialism is that kind of colonialism where indigenous populations are marginalized, removed, genocided away to make room for settler populations to come in and not only monopolize resources, monopolize the area politically, economically, but essentially totally take it over in ways that seeks to completely eliminate indigenous populations. And that was really the goal of this kind of colonialism, not only in the Americas, but places like Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii. And so we see that there are contemporary forms of this kind of colonialism. I began to think about settler colonialism in the context of Tibet, for instance, right? That it's not that it became radically depopulated, but it became depopulated enough where Han Chinese um, were brought in by the PRC government to kind of repopulate and manage and take up space and essentially settle and have power in those spaces. So that particular kind of colonialism is so devastating. And the link, when researchers were trying to understand historical trauma, they were like, well, what are all the components here? It's linked to maybe a mass event like a genocide, but we again think sometimes of a genocide as one single event. And a genocide, settler colonialism helps us understand that these forms of violence are not singular events, but instead they're structures that take place over time. They could take place over 100, 200, 300-year period. And in the case of, the Americas, 500 years, right? So this particular kind of violence where people are depopulated, structurally marginalized within their own lands is so devastating that researchers began to understand historical trauma was an outcome of this particular kind of political economic relation.
Great. So now, what do you mean by you know uh, letting the settler communities to come? This was a kind of a political, I would say. Was it a political trick the governments did? You know, Treating the Native Americans as a political threat to the lands.
So they basically began to redefine Native peoples as having no innate rights to their own land. And so, through not only religious justifications, because many of the settlers that came were Christian, and so they began to define the lands. Essentially, one of the first colonial documents that begins to legally justify the dispossession of indigenous lands is a 1493 papal bull, and this is a decree made by the Pope at the time, called the Doctrine of Discovery. And in this doctrine, it essentially argues that the lands can be claimed for the Spanish crown because they were empty of Christians. And so it's this kind of religious, but also political and economic logic that began to be employed against Native and Indigenous peoples to justify dispossessing their lands. And so even though these settlers were coming and they had no legitimate rights to these lands, they began to essentially manufacture legal constructs to justify for themselves the dispossession of these lands.
Hmm. In the discussion of settler societies who have been actually established, you know, in place of Native Americans, do you also treat immigration as a part of that, or is it little farther than that? The immigration happens in the U.S., probably Canada too, like in 1970s or something. So they wanted to let new people come in. Do you mean the immigration part, or probably the early societies that were settled down in the U.S. and Canada?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think there are some debates. When settler colonialism began to be theorized in the field of anthropology, I think that it was initially applied to those early encounters and those first settlers, in the um, 16th century, 17th century on. Um, and in terms of immigration, I think more recently, especially some Native and Indigenous studies scholars have began to think about immigrants as being in a third space or existing in a slightly different space. There are a lot of immigrants that come that are actually refugees, and they may be refugees of war. They may be refugees of other kinds of imperial projects that are forcing them to flee their own lands. And so, when we think about settler colonialism, it's always linked to power. So we have to understand it as attached to a particular kind of power, and the kind of power that was developed really during this period, this colonial period, was white European power. So even Europeans began to develop this concept of whiteness and superiority, intellectual, material, political, economic superiority. And that became part of the modern project. There are scholars that essentially argue that modernity itself is coloniality, right? That it's indicative of a particular relation of power vis-a-vis white Europeans and the rest of the world. And so, immigrants are sometimes European and considered quote unquote white, but sometimes they're not. And so I don't necessarily, there are some scholars that essentially say, refugees and other migrants are not necessarily existing in the same location of power that settler colonial actors are, right? So they're not able to exercise power in the same way. And so even though they are essentially occupying indigenous lands in the US and Canada and other parts of the Americas, they may not feel entitled to those lands in the same way that the early settlers did. But that's, of course, complex. Yeah.
Great. Let's make clear some of the, I would say, ways and policies that made Native Americans, I would say, traumatic in terms of the historical trauma, especially the US and Canada federal Indian policy enacted both extermination and assimilation, which created not only genocide at that time, and ethnocide, and as you mentioned, that it actually permanently subjugated and eliminated Native Americans as a political threat from their homelands.
That's right.
And let's be very clear about some of the things that happen for somebody who does not know, because I know you know. I mean, some of the people know, especially from the context. But for somebody who has no idea about what this is, what were the historical things that happened to Native Americans?
Yeah.
In this context as a trauma. Now, you particularly mentioned they were forced, removal from native lands
Yeah.
and compulsory boarding schools. This is another very
Mhm.
interesting thing that happened to them,
Mhm.
and course conversion through missionization. Is the second
Mhm.
one,
Mhm.
and uh, and a couple other things. So, could you elaborate on the elements of this historical trauma in the
Yeah.
lens of removal from native lands and then and asked to stay in compulsory boarding schools? And you know that a couple of weeks ago, one of the religious leaders visited Canada
That's great.
to ask
The Pope.
apology, I guess, for things happen. So how do you look at how do you elaborate these particular things that make them horrible, especially for their historical trauma?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that because that history is so long, and again, there isn't any one single event. And so researchers began to try and understand, well, what were the important components? And they began to ask people, and listen to their stories and understanding that things like the loss of lands, for instance, there were tribes that existed, tribal nations that existed in the southeast of the US. They were often referred to as the quote unquote five civilized tribes. This is the Choctaw, Cherokee. Um, this is Seminole folks and a couple of others, Chickasaw, um, and a couple of others that were forcefully removed. So there was these periods of time, and this really started in the 1600s when English settlers were existing along the eastern seaboard. And they began pushing into more of the center of the US. And as they were pushing in, there were skirmishes that were happening, small battles and small wars. So it's incremental, little by little. So it's that history of those skirmishes and these confrontations with settlers that became more and more greedy for their lands. They could never be satiated. And so, there are some Native people that say, we were all confronted with violence, whether it happened to your people sometime in the 1600s, whether it happened sometime in the 1800s. Little by little, that push from the eastern seaboard began to move western, western, western. And it was, in addition to skirmishes, it became legislated forced removals that started happening in the 1830s. And so people were literally marched away from their lands. And what's difficult about that um, part of what we have to understand is that for Native and Indigenous peoples, their sense of identity is deeply tethered to lands. So they understand themselves as the people of a particular place. So um, people on the eastern seaboard, say in the Massachusetts area, or what's now considered Massachusetts, in that kind of northeast region of the U.S., would say, well, we're the people of the dawn, right? They're people that witness the sun rising in the east in those waters, and so they deeply demarcate themselves through their land base, their sense of identity, but also their sense of responsibility, purpose, social purpose is really deeply tethered to their land base. And so their entire ceremonial life is based on the relationships that they have with spiritual powers embedded in lands. And so when people are removed from their lands, those relationships are severed. And that becomes deeply debilitating for people. The way that I've theorized it in my work as a kind of ontological violence or ontological dispossession. And so I like to think of historical trauma as really operating ontologically at this deep spiritual level, right? At this level of being. And that ultimately, once you get the 19th century, through the 1800s is where you really see the shift of land being lost over the course of that 100-year period. So the end of the Indian Wars, that I'd say the height of the Indian Wars were in the 1860s, 1870s, but by 1885, 1890, you really have the complete loss of the U.S. and the complete loss of control by Native peoples of their own lands within the U.S., and that the U.S. government has total control of this land base. And so that whole 100-year period is radically transformative. And what the U.S. government at that time was debating, because there were literal debates in Congress, in the newspapers, in public squares, in cities and states, over what to do around it was referred to officially as a quote unquote Indian problem. What are we going to do about this? This is a problem to be solved. How do we exterminate? How do we eliminate this threat? And so there were official policies. Some were extermination, and that's what the Indian Wars were about. They found that it was actually too expensive, and that to just mass murder people. But there were mass genocides where there would be 200-300 people that were just completely murdered by the U.S. cavalry or the U.S. Army. And so this happened throughout, the 16th, 17th, 18th century. And so these mass murders then, horrified some people in the general public. So there was a push to, well, let's develop an assimilation policy instead. This is the maybe less violent, more humanitarian option. The assimilation policies were not necessarily, they were violent in other ways, right? So because missionization was an important part of the American project, and dealing with Native peoples, it was essentially led by the logic that, well, if we can convert them to become Christians and we can help them become quote unquote civilized people, they may be able to be functioning members of our society. So in order to do that, you had Native people that were often removed from their own lands, put on reservations, whether it was Oklahoma or somewhere else. Maybe the reservation was in a small portion of their own homelands. And then you had missionaries move in, and they began to essentially govern, and they had full control over what Native people could and could not do. And people were forced to essentially be proselytized to. Their religious traditions were banned, essentially outlawed in 1883. And this itself was incredibly traumatic for Native people. Boarding schools were developed in the middle 19th century. And again, boarding schools were developed solely for the purpose of quote unquote civilizing Native people. So children would be stolen from their families. Literally, army officers, police officers would show up and take children away in handcuffs and take them from their families. And sometimes these children were as young as 3, 4, 5 years old. And they may not see their families again until they were 18 or 19. And so these boarding schools were functioning in the US until the 1960s. So it was a very long, like 100-year period of assimilation. And so these kinds of policies, assimilation and extermination, were incredibly impactful for Native peoples. And so that's why when we talk about historical trauma, that context is so important, that people were not only pathologized as primitive, perceived to be ignorant, superstitious, have no legitimate religion, have no legitimate political, economic rights to their own lands. They were essentially perceived as potentially going extinct because of the ideas at the time in the 19th century was this kind of social evolutionary biology, this kind of social Darwinism that assumed that Native people were not necessarily as sophisticated and cultivated as white Europeans, right? Um, that really shifted the way that they were treated, and I think that because they were Native people were essentially treated as, objects and so deeply dehumanized through racialization, the impacts were very, very deep. And so, again, when we talk about historical trauma, we're talking about those kinds of mechanisms. Yeah.
Even unpacking the series of events that happen to Native Americans can make someone even traumatic. Somebody who is not Native American.
Yeah.
Somebody might think that what's the problem of resettling of a kind of community? Uh, but the problem here, as you mentioned, for Native Americans, specific these lands where they were used to stay, they did not treat them as to be objects like normal folks. So we think that we can move to any place.
Right.
If you're gonna buy a land, if you're gonna buy a house, we're gonna move even tomorrow. It's not a big deal for us.
Right.
But for them, they do not treat the lands to be just objects, and because they think that they have a fascinating connection to the nature where the lands were located, especially with the plants, animals, waters. Uh,
Yeah.
it looks like a big connection. So how do we look at this connection? This could be the reason why they think that the loss of land is a big issue. Now,
Yeah.
for somebody, they might think differently. So
Yeah.
how do we look at this loss of land uh, and the loss of culture? They are interconnected. So loss of land and loss of culture. So how
Yeah.
do we look at this thing?
Yeah. Well, part of what happened in that dispossession process was not only were people separated from their lands and then their ceremonial lives were outlawed, when um, forces of power came in and there were skirmishes, battles between Native nations, Native peoples, and US forces, often it was religious and political leaders that were targeted. So people lost, as they lost their lands, as they lost their political, economic autonomy, as they lost access to their religious life, they also lost their religious leaders, their political leaders. So the infrastructure for their society really became totally compromised, right? And in terms of the loss of land, Native peoples, they've been described. There's a Lakota scholar by the name of Gangodawila Jr., and he has described Native peoples as existing in a responsibilities relationship with their environment versus a rights relationship. And so by responsibilities, he means they think in terms of, well, how is it that our society has a particular kind of purpose in this place? What kinds of ceremonial responsibilities do we have to the lands themselves, our non human relatives, as well as our human relatives here? How is it that each individual person is contributing? What is their unique role that can contribute to the health and well-being and the functioning of our social world, right? And so when that all that infrastructure is broken, people are left essentially without that foundation. They're left without that ability to care for lands, care for themselves, care for their non-human relatives. And really, this is the goal, I think, for Native religious life. We often think of ceremonial life that it's there to benefit humans. And it can be very beneficial to humans. But in a Native and Indigenous context, often ceremonial life is not just about maintaining and restoring our human health and well-being. It's really about trying to maintain and restore and care for the health and well-being of the lands themselves and the inhabitants of the lands, right? The plants and the animals and the waters, with this understanding that there's an intersubjective connection. There's a shared consciousness, there's a shared sentience among this community, and that humans are here essentially to care for it, to steward it. And so for Native people, when they lose their ability to steward lands, that becomes deeply um, cataclysmic. That in itself is part of the horror of the genocide.
Interesting to hear that you mentioned it's not even the health and well-being of the Native Americans, but also the health and well-being of the environment,
That's right.
the nature. That's an interesting way of looking at it too. Great. So let's move on to the rehumanizing aspects of the problem, historical trauma. Before we jump onto that, Dr. Avalos, could you talk a little bit about who coined the terming of historical trauma in the history?
Yeah, so it's often attributed to Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, and Dr. Braveheart is, I mentioned her briefly before. She's a Lakota clinical social worker, and she began to work on this issue within her own community and do research really in the 1980s and 1990s. But there were other people that were doing this kind of work too. Um, Folks like Eduardo Duran, Bonnie Duran, they were looking in the 90s in trying to understand the impacts of historical trauma on Native communities. So it's there was a percolation happening kind of at the same time, and once that term became cemented, it had it was productive in the sense that researchers were able to at least name this particular kind of trauma among Native peoples and understand the social factors that contributed to it.
Great. So from a what do you call dehumanizing, um, I would say aspect into rehumanizing aspect, as you mentioned in the article,
Mhm,
to find a solution for this particular issue.
mhm.
Concept of healing to this historical trauma is necessary. That's why we talk about healing, especially as you mentioned in the article. Healing is needed, but it has to be done not as a general treatment. You talk about this trauma is like a soul wound. It's not a normal wound. It's a soul wound. It is embedded in their life. So this healing can reduces the effects of othering, because they've been other as well as some of the perpetuation of the issue. So how do we look at healing process? Is there a practical way? Are there some of the I would say pragmatic ways that the healing can take effect, or is it just a concept? Because the historical trauma happened, and I think you know, even what happened, we saw in Edmonton, Canada, a week ago, I guess it was kind of, looks to be a kind of a healing. I don't know, I mean, how it went, the effects. So how do you look at the healing process to this historical one that affected Native Americans in the past?
Yeah, so you know, so the person that began to theorize historical trauma as a kind of spiritual or soul wound is Eduardo Duran. And when he was working with Native peoples, the way that they described it is that they had been wounded in their spirits, that their spirit had been wounded. They had been spiritually victimized, spiritually dispossessed, robbed, and I think it helps you understand that healing was about restoring your spiritual sense of well-being, safety, um, connectedness to others. Because again, in a native context, excuse me, in a native context, people are not necessarily viewing themselves as individualistic, I have a specific goal. You understand yourself as instead embedded in a whole world of relationships, and that those relationships shape your sense of purpose, your sense of identity, your sense of responsibility, the things that you do day to day. And so, you know, as Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart began starting to do healing work with her own community, one of the things that she kind of experimented with and she found were very effective was bringing people together and literally just sharing grief collectively. Partly because what trauma does is it estranges you, it breaks your relationship even with yourself, but as described, by others, that spiritual wound can break your relationship with the larger world, your set of relationships with human kin, other than human kin. And that the rendering those relationships is so traumatic, it's so harmful. So she thought, how do we restore those relationships? Let's bring people together and see how we can repair those relationships. So she asked people to share. And one of the things that was really critical for her, there was a couple components that she found very productive. One was that when people were given a context for their own suffering, and here this is very Buddhist, right? That when people were given a historical context of why they were suffering, because sometimes people, you have to understand that Native people, the history of what happened to Native people is not necessarily taught in the US. It's not taught in the public school system, private school system, not commonly. We have a very shallow understanding of what happened. And so Native people sometimes didn't have a very clear understanding of even how they got into their social circumstances. There were oral stories that were passed down. And so, it was very uneven. So when she began to get people together and provide them with a historical context for what happened, for instance, the Lakotas, she said, well, there were these massive genocides, these um, you know, huge massacres that happened, like Wounded Knee happened in 1890 for the Lakotas. She said, providing folks with that information, giving them a name for what they experienced, naming it and saying, this was a genocide. This is something that was really impactful and severe. And all of a sudden, people were able to understand themselves in a larger social, political, economic context in a way that shifted the blame. Because again, what trauma does is it can put people in a situation where they blame themselves for their own suffering, for their own pain. And she said, once you were able to attribute the actual cause of their suffering to this, set of circumstances, people began to open up and share, become a little less guarded. And she said another really important component was just getting together and allowing people to tell their stories of, people were able to talk about their grandparents that had maybe been impacted by Wounded Knee, by that massacre, or other kinds of skirmishes or battles, or the ways in which their parents or even themselves had been impacted by boarding schools, what they had lost, their levels of grief. Historical trauma was essentially described as a kind of, um, you know, deep sense of grief, historically unresolved grief, a grief that had no outlet. So she provided the context for that grief to be acknowledged, validated. There were conversations where people were able to see and witness one another. And it was in that witnessing that often they were able to actually feel and access the depth of their grief. And that in itself was deeply transformative because people were no longer holding it subconsciously or even consciously, and they were able to resolve it together. And that restored a sense of trust within the community in little, pockets of the community, but then that began to ripple out. Another very important component of healing was restoring ceremonial life. Because ceremonial life had been essentially outlawed, she said, well, you know what? We decided to implement an Inipi ceremony and the wiping of the tears ceremony. So the Inipi ceremony is essentially a sweat lodge ceremony where people go into a sweat lodge, and it's understood that they're essentially being purified through this process of sweating and sitting together around these hot stones in the earth, surrounded by relatives, loved ones, people that they could trust. And they felt as if they were entering the mother's womb again, and that they could be reborn, that they could reconnect with really that spiritual world, that spirit world that had been robbed, they had been robbed of. And the wiping of the tear ceremony was a traditional grief ceremony. And so that, of course, enabled people to express grief ritualistically in a way that helped them psychologically process what had happened to their ancestors. So these components all together, she essentially developed this healing program, and she began to take it to Native communities all across the U.S. And so these components are really important. Thinking about the ways that people are reconnecting to one another, their own histories, understanding their histories in a totally new way, attributing blame where blame should be attributed, and learning how to really restore that sense of trust and care, really restoring relationships, and that those relationships are human relationships, they're relationships with the spirit world, they're relationships with other than human kin. And it's in that restoration, for Native peoples, there's a sense of healing when they feel, when they understand themselves as having illness. It's defined as being out of balance. You're out of balance with your larger environment. And so, in order to restore health and wellness, you have to be brought back into balance. So, being brought back into balance means you are restored into your place of society where you are carrying out your responsibilities, meaning you are contributing to the health and well being of the larger social body. And that social body, and it's not just human, it's other than human, it's the spiritual world. And so it really is this complex world that you have to be reoriented to. And that's really where healing takes place.
Very interesting. Dr. Avalos, it looks like a deep philosophical disorientation that has actually happened to Native Americans. Also, it seems to me that the healing process should be focused not only on fixing their relationship with others, but also fixing their connectivity uh, to themselves, right?
Right.
Because it's a soul wound, right?
Yeah.
As you said that you propose, and even the scholars been talking about traditional grief ceremonies, like you mentioned a ceremony in particular, a Lakota grief ceremony. Was it a very historical ceremony that attempted to address this issue, and you want to share something about it?
Yeah. So she essentially, began to help people reconnect with ceremonies that had been marginalized because they had been outlawed. The thing that we have to understand is that for some Native people, their ceremonial life wasn't totally eliminated. They often continued to practice ceremonies underground uh, in hiding, but that meant that not everyone had access to it. And so there were people that were raised without that context. And especially if they were sent off to boarding schools, they didn't have access to that. So again, it left communities with a very uneven sense of ceremonial access. And so part of the process of restoration was recentering ceremonies. And something that had happened really even decades before that, this was post-civil rights when, Black nationalist and Latino nationalist movements began happening in the 60s and 70s that were essentially advocating for their own rights. Well, the Red Power movement, the American Indian movement and the larger Red Power movement was inspired by that, but they essentially arguing for sovereignty. They were demanding that their treaties be recognized. They were demanding their sovereignty be recognized. So they were saying, well, no, we don't want equal rights. We want sovereignty. We want our treaties to be acknowledged and respected. We want autonomy. We want um, to be honored as our own native nations. And in the process, there was also this real revitalization of ceremonial life that was happening at that time in the 60s and 70s. So I think for someone like Dr. Braveheart in the 80s and 90s, she and other researchers began to realize that that religious revitalization, that restoration of ceremonial life, was actually really helping people psychologically, spiritually, recover from those levels of trauma, from that history of dispossession. And so she began to link them and essentially help implement some of these things more formally. And of course, not every tribe has the same set of ceremonies. So she would work with the Lakota on specific Lakota type ceremonies, like the wiping of the tears ceremony. But then, say if she's working with the Navajo or others, they have their own set of ceremonies that she helped them navigate, and that's really what her program did.
Interesting. Before we jump on to a study that suggested, as you mentioned, about the healing, I would like to ask you about some of the issues at hand among Native Americans because of the historical one. What are the mental health issues that have impacted Native Americans because of this historical one?
Yeah, so what researchers had found was that there were incredibly high rates of suicidality, depression, anxiety. The suicide rates for Native Americans were something like 13 times higher than the national average. So you really had um, very critical levels of crisis. You also had other forms of structural violence that were impacting people. So, very high levels of poverty, unemployment. You had high rates of drug and alcohol use. You had high rates of interpersonal violence. You had, high rates of murder. Unfortunately for Native peoples, Native women in particular were very vulnerable to assault because Native tribes did not have the power to essentially try and convict and prosecute non-Native people. So Native women were very vulnerable to assault, rape, murder from non-Native men, specifically white men, and that's still an issue. So these incredibly high rates of violence, depression, anxiety, they were at crisis levels, and I think that's why researchers were doing this work. They knew um, that this was a problem that needed to be explored.
Mhm. Interesting. So one study suggests that in order for healing process to work, take effect, there may be a couple aspects to be addressed. One is to recognize their emotional burdens, as we already discussed a little bit, and to have a cathartic disclosure of
Yeah,
the emotions, and self as project reflexivity and recognizing the impact of colonialization.
yeah,
So along with these four, what do you think about the larger, broader perspective of the healing? Because now we are in the 21st century, because
yeah,
new things are coming up. Uh, urbanization takes place faster than we think. Things have been revolutionized. So, do you not think there should have an assimilation in a better way, not like the ways that we witnessed in the past, in a
yeah,
pretty horrible way? So, as you just said, Native Americans, women are facing a lot of problems. They are more vulnerable, far more susceptible for different crimes because of probably they may not have an orientation as you mentioned, probably in acting upon different things, probably from non-native Americans. So how do we look at this larger, broader perspective of finding solutions, um, not only for the historical trauma, but also for the problems at hand for them in the U.S. and Canada, maybe elsewhere too,
yeah.
right? That there are Aboriginals, First Nations in Canada, Aboriginals in Australia, uh, right? So, what kind of a process in terms of healing, and then other than that, can work for them, at least as a suggestion?
I think something so I do ethnographic work, and that's what I essentially was trying to understand in my ethnographic work. How is it that urban indigenous folks were navigating this? Because there's no one single coherent way. Dr. Braveheart developed her, what she called like the Takini um, system, and there were other researchers that developed different modalities. And what I found in my research was that people began to intuitively explore means. For instance, I worked with these two Native men who were in their mid 60s at the time. They're now in their mid 70s, and they were Vietnam veterans. And so they were part of a veterans, all Native American veterans group. And they had a talking circle and they had a sweat lodge. And so they built essentially an infrastructure for themselves to rebuild a sense of trust, to rebuild a sense of safety. They were able to share um, and explore the kind of catharsis through that sharing that enabled healing. They were able to open up and talk about not only their experiences in Vietnam, but also some of the experiences they had growing up in a racist country as a Native person, their own experiences of marginalization, racism, dispossession, and as they did that, they were able to heal and empower themselves, and I think that we also have to understand that healing is deeply linked to empowerment and political empowerment, the restoration of political power. Part of the reason why settler colonial powers that be wanted to eliminate and outlaw Native religious life was to destroy their political religious systems of power. And when you're able to destabilize people's political lives, that you're able to subjugate them. And so I think part of the Red Power movement was really seeking to restore political power to Native nations. And I think the part of the healing process is ultimately, the goal is to have fully restored political autonomy. And so really Native people are not interested in assimilating into US society in the same, I think that's true for a lot of First Nations people, Aboriginal and Maori people, that they're not necessarily, they're already somewhat assimilated in these societies, but that they're ultimately their goals are autonomy, political, social autonomy, and for their own, political, economic, and even religious power to be fully restored. And I think that is the ultimate expression of healing, is to have that full and entire agency. And so I'd say that in this moment, historically, that is what healing can look like. It's really tethered to that kind of autonomy. Yeah.
Right. Um, yes, Avalos, you wanted to add anything that you may have missed out on in our discussion? If not, you can go for conclusion after that.
The only thing I would add is that in order to connect it to Buddhism, something that I was really interested in was, well, were Tibetans impacted in this same way? Because this kind of framing of historical trauma is not necessarily connected or applied in Tibetan context. And there's some research, there's a researcher that works nearby at Europa, Sarah Lewis, who did work with Tibetan refugee communities in Dharamsala in India. And she essentially was saying, because of their Buddhist practice, it kept them resilient. It also kept them from codifying and deeply identifying with the events that happened to them. They didn't, because they see themselves as not necessarily having a stable sense of self, right? As Buddhists, they're like, well, these events aren't about any innate me. They don't define, I don't have an innate self that is redefined vis-a-vis these traumatic events of torture, dispossession, religious loss. Not that they weren't impacted. I think Tibetans were deeply impacted. They're deeply hurt and horrified by their loss of political autonomy, the kinds of violence that they experienced. But she was saying, part of what enabled them to essentially be resilient or protect them from deeper forms of trauma, what we would call historical trauma, I think, was their Buddhist practice and really just their worldview, their Buddhist view. They weren't taking it personally. They weren't redefining themselves. They understood those expressions of power and violence as having a karmic quality. Often when I was doing my own field work and interviewing Tibetans, they were saying things like, there's karma that happens with us individually, there's karma that's happening collectively, and that's what it is. So they weren't necessarily personalizing these And I think that's very instructive because it helps us understand that our worldview, and even in a, you know, for Native and Indigenous people, they see themselves similarly as living in a deeply interdependent world. But the specific Buddhist worldview of not having a stable, coherent, essential self, in the sense that karma is productive and fundamental dimension of your metaphysical world, it shifts, totally shifts the outcome. And I think that's really important for us to think about that, you know, when Native people are restoring themselves from those deep levels of dehumanization through um, reconnecting with one another, regenerating relationships, that it's very similar to some Buddhist practices, right? Of understanding your deep sense of interconnectedness. And so I think that itself can help us understand how those that have been impacted by structural violence, by other forms of political, economic violence around the world can be um, helped and really assisted and restored through not only Buddhist practice, but other kinds of ceremonial life.
Yeah, that's enlightening to connect the issue that has affected Native Americans to a community like Tibetans, especially with what they have been actually experiencing in their own life.
That's
Because kind of a Theravada Buddhist might think we don't have a self. How do we find out the self in this kind of a context? Rather than looking at it doctrinally, but looking this at uh, ethnographic as a case study that might really work, function in our understanding. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Avalos, Professor Avalos, for your answers and the enlightening, thought-provoking aspects of this topic. So, Dhamma folks, today you join for our 57th episode, wherein which we discuss about historical trauma that has affected Native Americans, in particular in the United States. I was joined by Assistant Professor Natalie Avalos. She's Assistant Professor of Ethnic Studies at University of Colorado Boulder, US. Thank you very much, Professor Avalos.
it. Thank you.
We were very much, impressed by these sharing. Especially, we were trying not to pick on anybody because we're trying to look at the problem without, uh, you know, you know, what do you call blaming anyone. Just to look at what really happened and what could be a healing process. What's the mental uh, health of Native Americans? So all looked actually really interesting. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Now, folks, we will be meeting you with another episode. So thank you. Stay tuned. Take care. Have a good night. Have a good morning.